Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Fire Rescue Wellness Podcast. This is episode 21. In this week's episode, I spoke with my friend, Dr. Jose Antonio from the International Society of Sports Nutrition. Joey and I talked about his research, the evolution of the sport nutrition field, protein consumption, meat sweats, and the importance of exercise. Thank you so much for listening, and please rate, share, and subscribe to the show. Now, here's Dr. Antonio. Thank you for joining me on the Fire Rescue Wellness Podcast. I'm your host, AZ. I find the research and resources and then provide the fire service with the so what, now what, to ensure the health and well-being of every member of our profession. Together, let's thrive. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Fire Rescue Wellness Podcast. I am joined today by my friend, Dr. Jose Antonio. Joey, say hello to my podcast people.
Hey, podcast people. I am currently in South Florida. The weather's beautiful. It is 75 and sunny. I hope, well, actually, I know no one else is enjoying this beautiful weather but me, but I'm excited to at least try to edify the audience a little bit. So, hey, let's rock and roll.
Absolutely. And it was 3 degrees when I woke up this morning, Joey. So thanks a lot. Okay. So very briefly, Dr. Scott Forbes, I know you know Scott Forbes, was on episode 8. And funny story, after that episode, one of my firefighter colleagues stated that he was now convinced of the importance of creatine. And so he started taking it. And I said, another supplement that might be helpful for you as a firefighter, a good option for you would be protein. And he said, Annette, I'm not doing it until a Ph.D. tells me to. So this episode, Joe Galley, this episode is for you. All right. Who is Jose Antonio? Tell us about yourself.
Wow. And I like that you've, this episode's dedicated to that one person who wants to learn about protein. But my background's actually a little bit different than most sports science people that you have had as a past guest. I actually was a biology major, and you got to go back to the 1980s when there was really no such thing as exercise science as a degree. And my love was always exercise science, but I was like, oh, well, I guess I'll be a bio major. It's close enough. It's science. If you know enough science, you can get by. And so I got my undergrad degree in biology at the American University. I got my master's in exercise phys. This is from Kent State University in Ohio, where I froze my butt off for like 2 years. I did not like that. And I got my Ph.D. from the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center in Dallas, Texas, and that was in the early 90s. And just a little preamble, we're talking about protein. I want to tell you a little story. This was back as an undergrad. You don't know anything, but at least I'm curious. I always say I may not be smart, but I'm skeptical and I'm curious. And I took a nutrition elective. Remember, this is back in the early 1980s. I remember the professor telling me, or telling the class, if you eat a lot of protein, it's bad for your kidneys. And what does a college student know? But I'm skeptical because I'm thinking, wait a minute, my uncle, who's a bodybuilder, eats a lot of protein. And he looks pretty healthy. And in fact, he is healthy. And when you look at, we all have a pair of eyes and we live through life. When you see athletes consuming a lot of protein, you're thinking, either the professor is wrong or they're wrong, the athletes, or it's somewhere in the middle. And that always stuck with me. And that's part of the reason, and this is the transition to Kent State, why I wanted to go to Kent State University, because a gentleman by the name of Peter Lemon was considered the preeminent protein expert at the time. And once you get into the mid 80s to the late 80s, there was, the tide was starting to shift a little where people were like, you know what? People who work out, they probably do need more protein, but still there was a lot of people who were highly skeptical and even would say things like, it's still bad for you. It's still bad for your kidneys. And so that's, we sort of fast forward to the 2000s where I started doing a lot of my protein research at Nova Southeastern University, which is in Davie, Florida. And also as a segue to that, as you are well aware, the sports nutrition category is really a brand new category. If you go back before the year 2000, there were very few sports nutrition courses at the college level. It was exceedingly rare. In fact, sports nutrition as a area of research was frowned upon. And that's why for my PhD, I actually studied muscle physiology, because if you said, hey, I like sports nutrition, I want to study supplements, they would laugh at you. It's like, that's not a real field. And now you fast forward to 2022, sports nutrition is, it's a very exciting field. It's sexy. People want to learn about it and whatnot. So I would have to say the ISSN, which you're a huge part of, has played a role in promoting the science of sports nutrition, whereby before the year 2000, people would say, there's no science to any of this stuff. It's all hogwash. It's snake oil. It's bullshit. And it's just not true. As you know, there's plenty of science now, particularly on protein.
I absolutely love what I'm hearing right now is that you were a rogue renegade in the research world.
Yeah. Well, want to hear another story about how I was a renegade. In fact, this is going back, I want to say late 1990s, early 2000. I don't remember the exact year, but Jeff Stout, who's a professor at the University of Central Florida, at the time, he was, I believe, at Creighton University. I was at the University of Nebraska in Kearney campus, and we gave a talk on sports supplements at the American College of Sports Medicine. And before we gave the talk, I was telling Dr. Stout, I'm like, man, this is like the most boring PowerPoint ever put together. It's just boring stuff. He's like, yeah, but you know what? ACSM has never had a talk on supplements. And so Jeff gave the history of it, like, someone started taking supplements back in the old Greek and Roman days, stuff like that. It's like, oh boy, people are going to be really bored, And then I talked about like creatine and vitamin C and some other, I was like, my God, they're going to be really bored because how would I say it? We stuck to the facts without telling a story. And I think that's a mistake a lot of scientists make. They don't tell a story because there's always a story behind all of this. If you just stick to the facts, I call that bullet point lecturing. It's like, here are the bullet points, here are the facts. And I'm like, okay, you really bored me now. I don't need bullet points. I could look up bullet points. But anyways, at the end of that lecture, we were attacked, verbally attacked. And remember, this is before social media. So imagine if social media was, God, there'd be videos of this stuff. But it was one of the most interesting things where people literally went up to the microphones and started attacking us personally, not scientifically, personally, like, oh, you guys, you shouldn't be here giving a lecture on sports supplements. This is all a bunch of hogwash, and just on and on. And Jeff's like, holy crap, what just happened here? They're like mad at us. And I'm like, yeah, it's funny. You present science and people get mad at you. I mean, but that happens. It happens. But that's not even the worst thing that happened. And you're gonna die when you hear something worse.
Oh no, what is it?
The current president of the American College of Sports Medicine at the time, we happened to run into her at some cocktail party. We're like, oh, let's have a beer, blah blah blah. And she came up to us and she said this, and I remember it vividly because I'm like, I can't believe she just said that. She said to both of us, if you want to have a career, you don't want to do any research in supplements. And I think Jeff was like, whoa, did she just say don't do research? I'm like, she said don't do research. And I was like, whoa, what? Don't do research? Wait, I thought that's what our job is, to do research. Even if you don't like the area, doing research is the only way to come up with answers. So that really shocked me. I was like, oh, I can't believe what I'm hearing. Now, it's not like this viewpoint was unique. A lot of people thought that. It wasn't just her. A lot of people. And in fact, that really was a big falling out for me. I was like, God, the American College of Sports Medicine, the culture of it is just so odd to me. It was very narrow-minded at the time. And it's changed, that was 20-something years ago. And it's changed where now you can actually give a talk on, creatine or something. But at the time, nobody wanted, the idea of imagine this, the idea of an academic nonprofit holding conferences just on sports nutrition was laughed at, and not just by ACSM. Also, the ADA, the American Dietetics Association, they're now called the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. They clearly were not fans of this. So the idea, it was just weird. I'm like, wait a minute, isn't science the way you answer this stuff? Not making personal attacks or just saying this field is bullshit. You got to embrace science. And to me, the biggest mistake people make, not just scientists, but people in general, is they sort of go into this ideological camp where they have a preconceived notion about a field. And I'm a big fan of, hey, it's always good to be skeptical, but you also got to be curious. I mean, if you're not curious, then you're no longer thinking scientifically. And so that whole thing, I mean, this was 20 something years ago. It's like, wow, but imagine how much things have changed. You know, you go to ISSN conference and they talk about nutrition, sports nutrition, supplements. It's to you and I, it's like, oh, it's normal. But you got to remember, you go back to the 1990s, that was not normal. People talking about this stuff at a conference was kind of frowned upon. So yeah, it's I mean, it's been an interesting, past 30 years, you might say, but I've enjoyed it. Hey, I don't mind being the villain every now and then.
I love it. And it's interesting. I talk a lot about the ISSN because it's one big family. I feel like I just have family members across the country and across the world. But the second thing, I say this all the time, the people that present at the ISSN conference are the most dynamic and interesting speakers. And I think now I understand why. Because we don't stick to the facts without telling a story. We always tell the story during the presentation. You have just put a label on what I have always inherently understood.
Yeah, and it's good that you understand that, but, I always ask people, hey, what other, when they say, hey, I want to go to the ISSN conference, first thing I ask is, well, have you been to other science conferences? And, whether it's a yes or no answer, I tell people, well, this is a little
sure
different.
Is.
Not different bad, but different, like interesting and not your typical science conference. Like, for instance, I think the most boring science conference I ever went to, this is when I was a grad student, was the Endocrine Society. And I'm like, what, I kind of like endocrinology and exercise. Let's, I'm going to go to it. And I was so bored. I was like, oh my God, this is so boring. I mean, I call it bullet point science. I'm like, okay, well, thanks for telling me facts while telling me the most boring story ever. I hate to say it, I need a story. And maybe do you and I have like short attention spans and we need, hey, tell me a story, please? Or are we supposed to be happy with hearing bullet point facts? And I can't, when someone bullet points me to death, I'm like, I can't deal with this. So, and when you look at other, just look at the podcast category. Why do people listen to podcasts? It's really to be entertained. It's like, hey, that was kind of interesting. Oh, and I learned something too. So that combination of telling the story and giving information is I'd say it's not natural for a lot of people. I think they have to learn it. And I remember the first time when I was a grad student when my advisor said, well, you got to tell a story. And I'm thinking, what is this, like Aesop's fable? I got to tell a story? I didn't know what that meant at the time. I'm like, okay, well, I guess I'll figure that out. Not sure what it means, but you get the gist. I mean, you're right. The community, the family of people who go to the conference. I mean, I don't know anyone who's like, for instance, I tell people, nobody's stuck up. Everyone will be happy to sit down with you and talk to you about whatever, about training, about nutrition, about supplements. And there aren't these gigantic egos that you might see at other conferences. And that's a huge thing. I mean, there's some big egos. It's at some of these bigger events. It's like, oh my God, you guys are so full of yourself. Come on, we're not curing cancer here. Come on, this isn't rocket science. We're not like shooting a rocket up into space. Come on.
That is hilarious. Well, and this also speaks to the way that I like to educate people in my stratosphere, whether it's on my social media or whether it's on the podcast. I try to give them the facts so that then they can do the so what, now what? Like, why should I maybe want to care? So today, I would like to educate the audience on why they might want to care about protein. And so my first question would be, what is protein and what does it do for your body?
Yeah, protein, well, it's interesting, like, because I was a bio major, protein was often viewed, like we view it as it's one of the macronutrients, right? Protein, carbs, fat. Whereas biologists typically view proteins as molecules. So you have enzymes that are made of proteins. You have actin and myosin, which are proteins. You have collagen, which is the most abundant protein in the body. So you almost have to separate. Are we talking about protein in a biological sense or protein in terms of food? And I think, for us, we're really talking about food. And as you know, proteins, the building blocks of proteins are amino acids. And of the amino acids, the ones that are most important are the essential amino acids, the ones that your body doesn't make, so you got to get it in your diet. So when we're talking about protein, my initial interest in it really had to do with the absolute constant bashing of protein. And I'm thinking, this is so weird. Why is it every year, going back to the 1980s, every year I hear someone, and not just random people, we're talking about educated people, saying that high protein diets are bad for you. They're bad for your kidneys. They're bad for your bones. And I'm like, here I am. I try to, okay, let's assume they're right. I'm looking for data. I'm like, okay, well, where's this data? And I can't find the data. I'm like, where's this data that it's so bad for you? Now, we're not talking about folks with chronic kidney disease. We're talking about normal, healthy, people. Like, let's get your average college student who's 18 to 21. They're typically healthy. Would it be bad if they consumed a lot of protein? And this constant refrain of it's bad, it's bad, it's bad. And here's something that you might find interesting. It is the only macronutrient where even scientists, dietitians, doctors, it's the one macronutrient where they will put a limit on, like a hard limit. Like if you consume more than 1.6 grams per kilo, that's it. Don't do any more. And I'm thinking, but why don't they do that with carbs and fat? They only do it with protein. So what is this thing about you have to limit protein because I guess you waste it? Like, you don't waste anything. The human body isn't meant to waste anything, but it's this hard limit that's always been annoying. I'm like, why are they so hell-bent on the 1.6 or 1.8 grams per kilo? So we're not even talking the RDA, which, is a total waste of time, 0.8 grams per kilo, blah, blah, blah. But some people eat that for breakfast. It's like, come on, that's so ungodly low. It's stupid. For people who work out, the RDA is stupid. Don't even stick to the RDA. You got to get at least, here's my thing. Got to get at least 1 gram per pound or 2.2 grams per kilo, right? Now, here's the funny part. If you were to ask 100 random scientists who are not part of ISSN, that'll be the caveat. How much protein people should eat? They'd probably say 1.6 to 1.8 for people who work out. My next question is, okay, what happens if you go to 2 or 2.2 or 3.0 grams per kilo? What happens? And usually the answer is either they don't know or you waste it. Now, most scientists know you don't really waste anything. If you don't use it for skeletal muscle protein synthesis or the synthesis of non-contractile tissue, you're still going to use it. You oxidize it as fuel, so you don't actually waste it. But really the question is this: what's the downside of consuming, let's go to 2.2 grams per kilo or 1 gram per pound? What is the downside? And nobody's ever told me what the downside is. There technically is not a downside. If anything, if you consume that much, it means you're consuming less of carbs and fat. Now, if you're an endurance athlete, okay, you might want to fiddle around with that. You don't want to drop carbs and fat because energy expenditure is fairly high. But if you're a strength power athlete, carb intake, fat intake, it's easy to get to. I think protein intake is the issue. So I think if you focus on protein intake, you can always backfill the rest of your diet with carbs and fat. And I think that's where people, instead of putting a limit on it, I think, sort of go higher, because it either will help you or have a neutral effect. Maybe it'll help body composition by promoting fat loss. Maybe it helps body composition by blunting your appetite a little so you don't eat, other junk or just excess carbs or fat. So there's two things going on. Why are people hell-bent on limiting protein and saying it potentially is bad? And why are people so hesitant to recommend a higher protein diet? That's always been odd to me. And when we did that first high protein diet study, this is going back to 2014, I believe, where we had people do 2 grams per pound, which I'll be honest, I can't do that. There's no way I'm doing 2 grams per pound. In fact, I tried it for a day and I'm like, man, I feel sick. I just can't. One, I couldn't eat that much food. Two, I'd have to get it from shakes. And after one day, I'm like, I'm sick of shakes. I'm not going to drink like 4 shakes a day, just at, 2 grams per pound. But when we did that study, it was one of those, I remember doing it and talking to some of my friends. I'm like, man, this is the biggest waste of time. I'm wasting my time because one, nothing bad will happen. I know that because I've been watching bodybuilders for like 30 years. And two, unless you change your training, again, nothing will happen. And what do you know? Nothing happened, literally, because we didn't change their training. So nothing happened. Body comp didn't change. Nothing changed. So it's like, well, of course, that's what I expected. But people were shocked when we did the follow-up study, the safety study showing nothing happened. It was meaning nothing in terms of a safety profile. It was perfectly safe. And again, we followed that up for, up to 2 years. And again, nothing happened. But the caveat is this. These are people who train. In fact, a lot of them train pretty intensely. I mean, they're maniacs when it comes to training. So the question I get is, well, what if my aunt or uncle who, they kind of work out, but maybe they walk their dog and, they might ride their bike on Saturday. And I say, well, first of all, they're not eating that much protein. Second of all, they don't want to eat that much protein. So for them, it's a moot point because that's not the audience that does it. The audience that does it are people who train very hard. And as you and I know, tell me if you agree, hardly anybody trains hard. Very few human beings train hard enough to warrant that kind of protein. And that's why, I tell people the caveat is this: these people train hard. Most human beings are obese. Well, no, let's backtrack. Most Americans are overweight or obese. And then of the ones who are not overweight and not obese, they are sedentary. So now let's take the sedentary normal weight people, and then there's a minority of them that train. Now think how small that group is. I mean, I'm so used to, because we do studies on trained people. My interest is in trained people. But sometimes I forget most people do nothing, like nothing. So the high protein diet stuff I've done has zero application for them because they do nothing. I mean, when they ask for diet advice, I tell them, my diet advice to you, stop eating junk. That's it. Eat less, stop eating junk. Don't worry about your protein intake because it doesn't matter to you because you don't do anything. So that's my little diatribe.
Well, I love that. And I think there's a couple of take-home messages. First of all, you heard it here. The RDA for protein is bullshit. The RDA is basically set so that a human being doesn't die. Am I correct?
Crazy,
It's not for thriving. It's for not dying. And the typical human, whether they exercise or not, so let's just say the typical firefighter would be well served to start somewhere in the range of about 1 gram per pound of body weight and then fill in with the carbs and fat. Is that what I heard from you?
Yes. And in fact, one of the sort of the follow-up question to that is, let's say you're dealing with a firefighter, they weigh 200 pounds. And he's like, you know what? My ideal weight is really closer to 180. So let's say they want to lose 20 pounds. Should I go for 200 grams of protein or 180? And my answer to that is this. You're better off going for the 200. Let's say you're 200 pounds, that's your original weight, rather than a 180, because there will be times when you don't hit 200 because it's work. I always tell people eating like this is work. It's not easy if you're not used to it. So go for the higher amount because there's no downside to it. If you're doing 200 grams a day and you weigh 180 pounds, there's no downside to that extra 20 grams. If anything, it might blunt your appetite a little so you don't have weird cravings. And also that extra might help body composition, which, I always say body composition, and people say, well, is it important? I'm like, well, it can be. It kind of depends. However, in general, let's exclude sumo wrestlers and maybe offensive linemen in the NFL. In general, right? Yeah, I assume you don't have any sumo wrestlers you deal with who are firefighters. It's best if their body composition is good, meaning their percent fat is helps them perform their tasks well. That in and of itself is an important thing. Is it a predictor of the best body composition performs best? No. But if you carry a lot of fat, you will do much more poorly than someone who doesn't carry much fat. It's just basic physiology.
Carrying a lot of fat, this is an analogy, I believe I got it from Dr. J. Dawes, but carrying a lot of excess body fat is very much like loading yourself down with a whole bunch of tools. So it's physiologically more costly to walk around, but then you actually don't have any tools. It's just costing you more to walk around during a job. So body composition is definitely important in our field. So I love that. Now, firefighters, I don't know if you know this, Joey, but firefighters are extremists. And so they're either on or off. It's yes or no. There's no nuance whatsoever. And so what they're going to hear is that however much protein that I'm supposed to eat, more is definitely better. Now, we know that more isn't dangerous, but more is not better in terms of it costs a lot of money to eat a high protein diet, right?
Yeah.
How about your people in your study, in your protein overfeeding study? Tell me about the protein farts. Was it bad?
Actually, that wasn't the biggest issue, and they did complain of that. Well, not even complain to them. Okay, this is normal. It wasn't. Put it this way, it's not a surprise. However, what was interesting was, I'd say some of the initial studies, half of the subjects were what they would call themselves bodybuilders, but half of them were just people who worked out. They ran, they lifted. I mean, they sort of like, hey, I do this just to be, general fitness. So they weren't necessarily trying to get bigger. And one of my favorite subjects, and she was a tiny woman. I mean, she must have been 100 pounds. She was a great subject because she stuck exactly to what was needed. If it was 3 grams per kilo, she did 3 grams per kilo. If she needed to do 3 shakes a day, she did 3 shakes a day. And I remember when we post-tested her, she's like, I have been hot and sweaty for 2 months, just so you know. And she said, in order to fall asleep, and it's already hot in South Florida, so imagine okay, it's hot in South Florida, and now you're just hot from eating protein. She said she would lay in bed without any covers and turn the fan on full blast because she was sweating all the time. Now, I mean, that's a typical response. I mean, hers might have been extreme where you're just hot because why? It's the thermic effect of protein. You are oxidizing protein as fuel because you can't store it technically. It's not like you can store excess carbs as fat or excess fat as fat. Protein you can't store. So and she wasn't the only one, but she had the best story. I'm like, oh my God, that must be really uncomfortable. She's like, yeah, slightly. But all of them, in fact, there's another subject. I'm like, man, you come in here and you always sweat. You're like sweaty. He's like, bro, it's protein. In fact, he volunteered for studies mainly because, hey, I'm saving money being a subject because you're giving me all this protein. So to me, the most interesting, I don't even call it side effect because it's, the thermic effect of protein isn't a side effect. It's an effect. That's just what happens. And all of them saying, I'm sweaty, I'm hot, my clothes are all wet in the middle of the day. I'm like, wow, I guess that's what protein does. So it's kind of working, isn't it?
So Joey is either studying protein or perhaps hot flashes, one of the two, but his subjects had the meat sweats. That's hilarious.
Basically, yeah.
Well, and I'm searching back in my memory vault here, and I'm thinking back to a talk you gave at NSC National. I think it was in 2019. Excuse me, I believe it was in 2019. And it was on your protein overfeeding study. Now tell me if I remember correctly. You were overfeeding your research participants by 500 kilocalories per day, but that overfeeding was coming from protein and they did not gain body fat. Did I get that right? Do I remember correctly?
No, that's actually correct. In fact, but this was the sort of, I guess the limitation is that we had a high protein group, so they ended up roughly 3.4 grams per kilo. But the control group, I told them you're not supposed to change your intake, but they also increased their intake to roughly 2 to 2.2 grams per kilo. So in essence, it was a comparison of a really high protein diet to a high protein diet, which I'm like, okay, well, it is what it is. And they're not supposed to eat more, but they're like, hey, I'm in a protein study. I'm going to eat more protein. But the interesting thing about that was that we put everyone on sort of the same traditional bodybuilding training program, which, split routine, chest, shoulders, strides, back bis, legs, you rotate it, take a day off in between. And both groups gained the same amount of lean body mass. So whether you're at 2.2 grams per kilo or 3 point something, they gained the same amount of lean mass. However, the higher protein group, even though they consume 500 more calories per day, they actually lost more fat mass, which is like, that's kind of weird. I mean, when scientists find things interesting, they're like, wow, that's really weird. But they lost fat mass. And we think it was, protein has such a great high thermic effect. That has to be part of it. The other part is people say, well, maybe they lied about what they ate, which, as you well know, people lie about what they eat. In fact, they tend to, like, for instance, people who are overweight tend to underestimate their food intake and overestimate their activity. So people say, well, did they lie about their food intake? And, my response is, well, if one group lied, wouldn't the other group lie, since they're both technically on a high protein diet? So that should be a wash if both groups are lying. So why is it? Why would one group lose more fat mass by eating more protein? It's got to do the thermic effect of protein. Maybe there's some effect on non-exercise activity thermogenesis, or NEAT or NEAT. Maybe it affects, metabolic rate while you're sleeping, sleep energy expenditure. There's all sorts of possible mechanisms. I personally am not interested per se in the mechanisms, like the why. I'm more interested in the practical application. Like, if I do A, do I get B and C, or do I get X or Y? And that way you can give, pragmatic advice to people. Versus, the mechanistic stuff to me is interesting, but it's not the kind of research I want to do. I'm hoping someone else will do it. I think that would be great, but not my cup of tea right now.
Well, that raises an interesting question. So our firefighters are very much a representative of the general population, which is typically about 70% overweight and obese. And so obviously, great advice.
Actually, can
Yeah.
Can I stop you there? Can you define, because I like asking this question. When does someone who's overweight become obese? Like, what's the metric?
That is a great question. I just see that cited everywhere, overweight and obese, and I don't know. Tell me.
Well, I'm not sure I know myself. I know the idea, BMI is often used if it's over 25, you're overweight, but I know plenty of guys who are over 25 who are muscular. But you can't do body comp on like thousands of people, so you go with BMI. I'm not sure, because visually, people who are obese, visually it's like, wow, they do carry a lot of extra fat. Overweight is a little trickier because are these people just chubby? Because technically you could have athletes that are overweight, but they perform well. Like a lot of the large football players, you might argue are overweight, but for their skill set and position, they kind of have to be that weight with a little bit extra fat, because it's part of the skill set of that position. So I don't know, because I remember reading this paper that suggested by the year 2030, 50% of Americans will be obese. And I think they use BMI over 30. And I'm thinking, okay, well, outside of bodybuilding, if you have a BMI over 30, you're probably obese. But that's, so that's obesity. Now, what about overweight? So overweight is 25 to 30. So of the remaining 50%, how many are overweight? And this is where I'm not sure what it is. A lot of it is, well, if you look at someone, when you see overweight, it's overweight. When you see obese, it's obese. It's just one of those things where you know it when you see it. Outside of the athletic population, I'm not sure. Like, is 25.5 overweight? In terms of BMI, I don't think so. I think my BMI is like 26 or 27.
Whoa,
I'm like, wait,
just kidding.
am I overweight? Hell, I don't like this definition. so yeah, it's like when you're dealing, and part of this is sort of a personal curiosity when you're dealing with firefighters, and you have to decide, are you overweight or obese? Do you tell them that? Is this like part of the conversation? It's like, well, do you tell an obese person overweight and just use overweight, or does the word obese carry with it some sort of stigma that no one wants to hear they're obese?
Well, maybe I have a better way of asking the question then. So instead of referring to overweight and obesity, I'll ask you this way. Our firefighters are very much apt to get cardiovascular disease, potentially due to their body composition, their inactivity, the high performance demands placed on them, their sleep deprivation. There's lots of things tied up in it. So as a population that suffers from cardiovascular disease, is there any space in the discussion for talking about controlling body composition with protein or other sports supplements?
So you sort of dance around it without, you're like square dancing without getting to the main point, which I guess you have to do because I guess with some people that's how you have to communicate. So, but I see where you're going. It's you have these risk factors. What's the best way to deal with them? And is body composition part of what we need to do? Which, yeah, I mean, I guess that works. That could work for a lot of people. Others might need more direct. They might say, "Hey, just tell me, Annette, am I fat? Am I fat? Do I need to lose weight? Just tell me. I need to know."
Just
stop beating around the bush.
So I feel like there's space in the discussion though to educate firefighters on the potential for, increasing their protein intake to help, decrease their hunger response, increase their thermic effect of eating, all of those types of things. Would that be a true statement?
No, that's definitely true. And, people will say it's difficult, which I agree with, because I agree. Protein and fat, that combination, carbs and fat, the combination of carbs and fat tastes better than protein. It just does. I mean, I always say, and in fact, my daughter says that she's like, I could be completely full, but you put dessert in front of me, all of a sudden I have room in my stomach, But if you're completely full and someone puts another slice of steak, it could be the best steak. You're like, I'm full. I don't think I have room for steak. So our tongues, it sort of makes sense evolutionarily. Once you're full and satiated, maybe your tongue's like, you know what? I wouldn't mind a little bit more sugar and fat because it's easy to digest. It's flavorful. I've gotten enough protein, let's say, from a meal. But I think it's important that protein is emphasized. And I'm not a big fan. I always say dieting or nutrition shouldn't be about mathematics. But if there's one thing that someone can track, it would be protein intake. So, you get your 1 gram per pound. Let's say weigh 150 pounds and you eat breakfast, lunch, dinner. So you're averaging 50 grams per meal, which isn't terribly difficult, but, it requires work. But I think as long as that number and that goal is always in their head and they're aware of it and they're cognizant of it, they will I think most people do their best to hit it. Now, I always tell people, doesn't mean you'll hit it every day. And there might be some days where you get more. Maybe on, weekends you like to go out with friends and you probably eat more total calories, but because of that, you're probably also eating more total protein and you go over it. That's fine too. But don't expect to hit it all the time. There's going to be a point where you're just going to drive yourself crazy trying to hit a number, which, the point of this isn't to hit a number. The point of this is to make a permanent lifestyle choice and change that is sustainable. And I think that's the hardest part. I don't know, what experience I've had. And I always tell people I don't really like working with humans because most of them don't listen to you and they can't sustain anything. So the few I work with, I'm like, okay, I know you're highly motivated and you'll actually take the advice I tell you. So I work with few humans. And they're like, well, what do you work with? Few humans. I just can't deal with, large number of humans getting advice from me. But that's hard for a lot of people, is the idea that they have to sustain it. when people ask me for general exercise advice, the first thing in my mind is, are you willing to do this forever? I mean, till you can't do it? Not for the next 28 days, not for the next 6 months, but are you willing to do this forever? And I think that kind of scares a lot of people, but until the reward is internal, meaning, some people work out because they look better, they get abs or whatever, but the reward ultimately has to be internal, meaning you do it because you just like doing it and you feel better from doing it, not you look better. Although looking better is a good motivator, but at the end of the day, when you're 50 or 60, you're probably not doing it to look better. You're just doing it because you feel better. And feeling better is really 99% of it. If you feel better, you probably just, overall life is better. So
preach it. That is, as a 51, soon to be 52-year-old, I just want to feel better. Well,
yeah, exactly. I don't know about you, but I turned 60 this year, and I have this weird perspective because I'm always around college students. So I'm around 18 to 20-year-olds all the time, right? So I always think, I sort of feel like the story of like the boy who gets adopted by wolves and thinks he's a wolf. Well, sometimes I think I'm between 18 and 21. I mean, not seriously, but because that's who I'm around, and I'm around always people who work out, and of which 90% of them are in better shape than me. And then I realize when I wake up in the morning, I'm like, oh my God, I am not 18 to 21. Oh. I am not. My body is sore, and I am not recovering like I did when I was in grad school. But you know what? It doesn't stop me from working out. I'm like, okay, I'm sore. That's it. But hey, the alternative is 100 times worse. Doing nothing is the worst thing you can do. And the moment you quit moving, the moment you quit exercising is the moment you start dying. And I ain't going to do that.
I agree so much. Well, I want to be super respectful of your time. And so I usually end up with, is there anything that I should have asked you about protein or your protein research that I missed the bus on?
Well, the way I would summarize is one, the protein intake is important for people who don't exercise as well as those who do. However, the people who are going to sustain consuming a higher protein diet, and let's call it 1 gram per pound, are generally people who work out. People who don't work out, I'd say don't even worry about it, because if you don't work out, protein intake is the least of your worries. You need to move your body. So that's number one. Number two, there's no evidence that protein's bad for your kidneys, even if you eat a lot of it. One of my subjects, he consumes 500 to 1,000 grams a day.
Damn.
A day. He's perfectly healthy. Yeah. First of all, I think it's incredible you could eat that much. I mean, forget the health stuff. I'm like, how do you eat that much? He's like, hey, bro, I do 8 shakes a day, and then I eat like steak and tuna and chicken. I'm like, whoa, okay. That's pretty cool. The other thing is, I don't know if you've heard this, but the idea that protein intake is bad for bone mineralization, particularly with women. And, I did that 1-year study in highly trained women. Eating a high protein diet, no effect on bone mineral density, their T-score, or anything. So when you're here's the thing, nutrition, protein, et cetera, are important things, but the signal that is most important is exercise. If you're not exercising, all this other stuff is just fluff. And that's why I tell people, dial in on exercise, make sure you got that correct, and then worry about the sort of secondary stuff, which would be diet, protein intake, et cetera, et cetera. So people you work with, if they're not training, and you know this, if they're not training, it's like, well, you got to train. And the reason I emphasize so much on the training part is people who train, it affects all the other behaviors in their life for the most part. And we're talking about in the aggregate. Obviously, I'll give my dad as an example. He used to smoke before he worked out. I'm like, okay. Before he'd get on the stair stepper, he's like, I'm going to have a cigarette because, it kind of hypes
Lord.
me. Like, oh my God. Yeah. So, there are people who do weird things. So, but in general, if you train, you tend to eat better. You tend to sleep better. You tend not to smoke. The drinking part, that's all over the place because I have plenty of friends who love to drink. So, but in general, the idea that good behaviors cluster, whereas bad behaviors also cluster, exercise is the single most important behavior. I'd say diet follows that, then maybe sleep follows that, and then maybe having good friends follows that, and not being a prick follows that. So people are like, well, you shouldn't be a prick at all. Well, some people are pricks and they work out. So, but yeah, so dial in the training and then get that nutrition in there and make sure that's right.
I love it. Well, I will definitely put the ISSN website in the show notes. Is there a particular way, if a listener wanted to reach out and contact you, is there a particular best way that you would like them to use?
Yeah, actually the easiest way would be, there's an email listed on the ISSN site. It's issn.net. That is issn.net. Just, you could contact me through there. Also, I want to make a crass commercial plug for the ISSN conference, June 15 to 17 in Fort Lauderdale Beach. The beach is beautiful. You will love it. It's a lot of fun. So that conference, it's our 20th conference. And, as you know, you learn stuff, but you also meet great people, and it's also a lot of fun.
I could not endorse that statement more. It is something that I look forward to for the whole year. I plan my year around it. I plan my vacation around it. Let's all go to the ISSN conference, because what's the tagline? Why go anywhere else?
Exactly.
Well, Dr. Antonio, my friend, this has been wonderful. I appreciate you. And listeners, this has been Joey and AZ, and we are officially out.